And now the Deeper Thinking podcast, a daily exploration into how philosophy, psychology, and technology shape how we think, feel, and live.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. They don't ask you to forget, they ask you to convert, to turn suffering into story, to turn story into strategy, to arc, conclude, inspire. If your pain doesn't educate, it alienates. If it doesn't uplift, it isolates. Welcome to the binary, TED or dead. This isn't a metaphor, it's the structure. The emotional economy of our time rewards clarity over complexity, redemption over resistance. If you can narrate your trauma with enough poise and perspective, you get to re-enter the world. If not, you're framed as unwell, incoherent, not yet ready. TED is not just a stage, it's a survival mechanism. But what if refusing that arc is the only honest act left? This essay is for those who decline the conversion, who resist the formatting of their pain into palatable narrative, who remain misaligned not out of fragility but fidelity. Because some experiences can't be arced without betrayal. Some truths don't want to be converted into content. Some memories refuse TED-style closure, not because they're unfinished, but because they're still true. We are living through a genre crisis. Emotional life has become a performance piece. Grief is only acceptable if scored with perspective. Rage must arrive with a disclaimer. Recovery is more marketable than rupture. And the measure of your growth is how gracefully you edit the parts that would disrupt someone else's optimism. Accuracy in such a system feels like holding a lit match in your mouth while being asked to smile. The world doesn't want the flame. It wants the image of it being extinguished. Consider the toolkit. Welcome to Adaptive Excellence, a 5-step compliance journey for post-trauma integration. Step 1, flatten nuance. Step 2, reframe injustice as insight. Step 5, present your adaptation at the quarterly Empathy Summit. Bring visuals. This isn't satire, it's epistemology, a way of knowing shaped by the demand for narrative, not truth. The self that adapts best is the one that disappears on time, especially if that self is racialized, gendered, disabled, or poor, especially if the harm is ongoing, unacknowledged, or profitable. To resist adaptation is not to fail, it's to remain accurate. And to remain accurate in a world that demands performance is to become unreadable, inconvenient, unbookable. This is not an argument against healing, it's an argument against auditioning. So this essay will not arc, it will not land, it will not pivot, it will remain jagged, unresolved, and narratively disobedient. Because in a culture where only the TED-worthy survive, the refusal to perform becomes the last form of truth. Adaptation is not just personal, it's patterned. Over time, it becomes protocol. The person who adjusts fastest forgives earliest, who repackages pain into insight the most gracefully, this is the one who is praised. But praise is not proof of health. Sometimes it's evidence of compliance. Because under systemic injustice, adaptation isn't freedom. It's formatting. Formatting is emotional standardization. It happens in therapy sessions that seek coherence over critique, in HR trainings that valorize resilience without addressing structural harm, in families that reward silence with safety. The self becomes an asset, regulated, intelligible, valuable, but beneath the legibility lies erasure. Erasure of the grief that didn't resolve, of the anger that wouldn't behave, of the memory that didn't make sense. And when that formatting becomes internalized, the self begins to mistrust its own refusal. You start to wonder, am I too sensitive, too slow, too damaged to grow? But these are not personal defects. They are evidence that your emotional life is still in contact with reality, that the part of you that won't adapt is still protecting something vital, something unformatted. To protect that is not dysfunction, it's resistance. Because if every wound must be narrativized into strength, every system gets away with it. If every survival becomes a success story, then injustice becomes efficient, tolerable, even beautiful. That is how pain becomes cinematic, not through glamorization, but through structure, through the demand for plot. And once the plot is set, deviation is seen as incoherence. But incoherence here might be the only way to tell the truth. This is what institutions have learned to harvest, the polished story of survival. Not the rawness of rupture, but the marketable arc of recovery. It becomes a kind of currency, The person who has adapted can re-enter, can be employed, can be platformed, but their legibility is conditional. It depends on how much of their pain they've converted into something useful, something beautiful, something sellable. The world doesn't need your suffering to stop. It needs it to make sense, preferably in the past tense, preferably with a tone of gratitude. And so the self, seeking safety or just a return to normalcy, becomes its own PR department, editing out the dissonance, rounding off the rage, smoothing the narrative for re-entry. This isn't healing, it's public relations, and that PR serves more than interpersonal comfort. It serves structural preservation. The faster someone adapts, the less pressure there is to change the system that harmed them. The emotional economy of resilience becomes a substitute for political transformation. The work of adaptation gets spiritualized, professionalized, even monetized, until refusal itself begins to look irrational. But refusal is not irrational, it's inconvenient, and that's why it's dangerous. It doesn't offer a clean ending or a useful message. It interrupts, it stalls the narrative, it refuses to become a lesson. And in doing so, it reclaims pain as something more than prelude. Because the moment your story becomes usable, it's no longer yours. It's content, it's curriculum, it's campaign, and sometimes the only way to stay sovereign is to stay misaligned, to feel wrong in a world that demands you feel better, faster, and in ways that can be shared. Refusing to adapt isn't the absence of healing, it's the presence of memory. Not nostalgia, not fixation, but an unwillingness to let harm vanish just because time has passed and the narrative has moved on. This kind of memory doesn't bend itself to fit the frame. It doesn't offer catharsis. It lingers. It reopens. It ruins the ending. And yet that lingering is often misread as failure. The one who still aches is seen as stuck. The one who won't forgive becomes a threat to group cohesion. The one who remains incoherent, too emotional, too angry, too silent, is framed as incomplete. But this is not a psychological lapse. It is an ethical position. In a world that rushes toward redemption, the person who stays unresolved protects the event from erasure. This is where the cinematic logic breaks. The arc demands transformation. The audience expects it. The structure insists. But some stories collapse under the weight of plot. Some people cannot recover without lying. Some truths cannot be shared without being softened. And so, to remain outside the arc is not to be lost. It's to be exact. It's to hold the original injury in its full size and refuse to narrate it small in this way. Refusal becomes a form of realism, a refusal to perform what hasn't occurred, a refusal to become emotionally legible just to make others comfortable. It is not a refusal to grow, but a refusal to grow into a shape designed by harm. And that refusal, uncelebrated and often punished, is not just brave, it's accurate. It is what protects meaning from being metabolized by systems that only know how to measure outcomes, not truth. To be misaligned with a world that rewards adaptation is to risk being seen as defective. But defectiveness in this context is a measure of integrity. It means you have not adjusted well to conditions that should not be adjusted to. You have not reconciled with a reality that asked you to abandon something essential. That misalignment is not the wound, it's the witness. This is not about staying wounded, it's about staying truthful. And sometimes truth requires a deliberate lack of progress. It requires the rejection of arc, of closure, of formatting. It means letting a part of yourself remain unfit for circulation, not because you're broken, but because the world isn't fixed. In this, a new ethic emerges, an ethic of emotional disobedience, one that doesn't frame healing as moral obligation, one that doesn't turn recovery into an act of redemption, one that refuses to offer clarity where there is only damage. This is not an invitation to dwell in harm, but to dwell in reality. Because healing, when demanded too quickly or too publicly, can become denial by another name. There's a silence that comes with this kind of refusal. It's not quietude, it's not peace. It's the silence of someone choosing not to narrate, not to make sense, not to convert. It's the silence of resistance, a refusal to comply with the affective demands of a culture that monetizes resilience and performs empathy but never truly listens. So if you feel out of sync, unresolved, emotionally unfinished, know that you are not alone. That feeling is not a failure, it's fidelity. A fidelity to what really happened and to what still has no words that wouldn't betray it. Adaptation becomes most dangerous when it masquerades as wisdom, when pain is polished into perspective and the jagged edges of injustice are filed down into something shareable. We are taught to aspire to that transformation, not just for ourselves, but so others can feel hopeful in our survival. But what if hope, in this case, is a form of complicity? What if the transformation we are praised for is the very thing that renders the harm invisible? This is how systems sustain themselves, not through force, but through affective incentives, through rewards for coherence, through applause for narrative resolution, through institutions that ask us not just to recover, but to recover beautifully. And if we do, we are platformed. If we don't, we are pathologized. In that split lies the real cost of emotional compliance. The refusal to adapt doesn't just threaten interpersonal harmony, it threatens institutional legitimacy. It raises the question, if this person still suffers, what does that say about the system they were forced to survive? It introduces friction, and friction is risk. So the world moves to resolve the friction, not by reforming the system, but by reframing the survivor. Reframing comes softly. It arrives in compliments, in invitations to speak, in frameworks that describe our trauma as necessary for growth. But growth that depends on injustice is not growth, it's grooming. It is the shaping of a self that can endure the unbearable without complaint. To resist that shaping is lonely. It means declining invitations that would reward you for being palatable. It means saying no to coherence. It means remaining illegible long enough that your pain retains its force, not because you need it to define you, but because the world should not be allowed to forget. The cost of remaining illegible is high. It can mean exclusion, misunderstanding, even abandonment. But the cost of legibility, of adapting into a form that comforts others, is often higher. Because once you adapt too well, the world stops asking what broke you. It only notices how well you've carried it. And then the archive fills with stories of resilience, not rupture, with models of adaptation, not evidence of violence. The public record becomes one of emotional agility, spiritual transformation, personal growth. But growth alone is not a moral good, especially when it comes from accommodation rather than justice, from survival rather than sovereignty. This is how power launders itself through personal narrative. The harm disappears behind the excellence of the person who overcame it. The system never has to account for what it produced, only for the beauty of what endured. But some people don't want to be beautiful. They want to be true. They want their experience to remain unconvertible. They want their refusal to become its own kind of document, not of failure, but of protest. Not of incompletion, but of contact with the real, with the unhealed, with the unresolved. To live like that is not to be broken. It is to be intact in a different register, in a register that does not end in narrative, but in memory, that does not aspire to closure, but to clarity. Not the clarity of explanation, but the clarity of presence. To remain here emotionally out of tune with the world's pace is to keep alive a different kind of clock, one not governed by healing, but by honesty. And in that honesty, even if no one claps, even if no one listens, there is integrity, there is alignment, there is refusal. And sometimes that's the only freedom left. The ones who refuse adaptation often disappear, not because they vanish, but because the world stops looking. They are no longer visible in the frameworks of success, no longer cited in the stories of recovery, no longer invited into the rooms where healing is celebrated. Their pain is too jagged, too slow, too unformatted. And so they're framed as unhelpful, unwell, unready. But what they carry is not a lack. It is a record, a continuity, a refusal to let time or applause erase what still exists. Their presence is an indictment, not of individuals, but of systems that mistake emotional legibility for ethical repair. There is no institution that knows what to do with someone who cannot be fixed, who does not want to be reintegrated, who doesn't translate their experience into an action plan or a framework or a life lesson. These are the ones who live at the edge of the narrative, bearing witness not to what was overcome, but to what endures. Their refusal is not defiance, it is fidelity to what happened, to what cannot be made right, to what should never be made normal. To remain unfixed is not to remain in pain, but to remain in truth. A truth that doesn't settle, that doesn't conclude, that doesn't offer comfort, but in its discomfort it becomes impossible to exploit, impossible to quote, impossible to turn into strategy. And so these people become difficult to love, difficult to hire, difficult to market. But that difficulty is their power. They cannot be used to prove that everything is fine now. They do not participate in the lie of closure. They remain as interruptions, as witnesses, as truths that cannot be narrated without consequence. And in a world built on adapting too fast, their stillness is radical, their silence is loud, their presence is proof. There is a reason so many frameworks reward coherence, because coherence quiets dissent. When someone tells their story in a way that wraps, resolves, and uplifts, it reassures the system that nothing needs to change. But unresolved pain is not bad storytelling. It is honest. It reveals that some conditions cannot be redeemed, some harms cannot be integrated, some experiences refuse arc. The pressure to adapt, then, is not just psychological, it is political. It asks the injured to narrate in ways that sustain the structures that injured them. It converts feeling into performance and performance into proof that progress has occurred. But progress for whom? At what cost? To resist that pressure is to become illegible, not broken but unreadable by a world that only knows how to value survival when it comes packaged in gratitude and grace. And when you refuse that packaging, when you remain visibly affected, stubbornly misaligned, you become inconvenient. You become a problem. Not because you are wrong, but because you reveal that something else is. This is not an argument against recovery. It's an argument against recovery as disguise, against healing that serves others more than the self, against narratives that edit out the system in favor of the survivor. The truth is, many people recover not because the world got better, but because they stopped asking it to. That is not healing, that is withdrawal. So when you feel yourself resisting resolution, don't rush to make sense of it. Listen, that resistance may not be trauma, it may be truth. It may be the last part of you that remembers the cost of adapting and the quiet violence of what you were asked to leave behind. Adaptation in its most celebrated form is often indistinguishable from abandonment, of feeling, of memory, of the parts of the self that cannot function inside unjust conditions. But instead of naming this abandonment, the world calls it maturity, emotional intelligence, growth, as if the capacity to carry pain quietly were a virtue rather than a necessity engineered by environments that offer no other choice. In this way, adaptation becomes a technology of erasure. It deletes the parts of experience that cannot be monetized, cannot be narrated, cannot be resolved. And in their place, it installs an image, the capable survivor, the one who has transcended, the one who has learned. But learning here is not transformation, it is obedience. It is learning how to speak in ways that don't trouble others, how to remember without accusation, how to suffer without consequences. The self is not healed, it is revised. And the revised self circulates easily through social scripts, through institutions, through therapeutic and corporate cultures that demand positivity, resilience, and closure. It is welcomed, it is platformed, but it is no longer whole. It has become a curated fragment, trimmed of its most radical truths. To resist this is to live with the discomfort of being unreceived. It means staying too angry, too sad, too confused for the timelines you're given. It means refusing to convert your survival into performance. And it means protecting the parts of yourself that still grieve, not because they're weak, but because they remember. Memory, when it refuses adaptation, is not a wound. It is an archive, an ethical stance, a disruption, a form of refusal so complete that it cannot be co-opted. And in that refusal, something original remains, something untouched by the world's demand for redemption, something that might one day be called justice. There is an unsettling symmetry between adaptation and amnesia, not the clinical forgetting of events, but the slow ethical numbing that allows us to reclassify harm as endurance, displacement as maturity, abandonment as independence. It's not that we don't remember what happened, it's that we stop allowing the memory to carry consequence. We turn it into something ornamental, something educational, a private archive of resilience sealed off from structural critique. This is the final form of emotional compliance, when the self becomes an exhibit of what the world can do to a person and still have them thank it. To resist this is to do more than refuse healing. It is to reframe healing itself, not as recovery to prior norms, but as transformation of those norms. It is to say that becoming functional again is not enough if the system we are re-entering requires the erasure of our pain to operate smoothly. It is to ask, what would it mean to heal in a way that doesn't flatter the world? In this final refusal, a different ethics emerges, one that is not about balance or regulation or even coherence, but about fidelity to what should not be assimilated. To hold that line is to carry discomfort not as a defect, but as a signal, not as a symptom, but as resistance, and in that resistance to make visible the world's demand for adaptation and to calmly, relentlessly decline. Not because you are unwell, but because you are unwilling. Unwilling to call yourself whole when the conditions that fractured you remain untouched. Unwilling to participate in a system that counts emotional compliance as evidence of fairness. Unwilling to adapt to what should never have been survivable. There is no final word here. To end would be to comply. To fold these truths into a neat resolution would be to betray the very premise of the essay, that not all suffering should adapt, and not all memory should be metabolized into meaning. This refusal is not poetic ambiguity, it's epistemic resistance. It's the deliberate maintenance of that which remains illegible to institutions trained to extract coherence from harm. Healing, when shaped to serve systems, becomes strategy. And strategy, when stripped of its ethics, becomes suppression with a smile. We are told that recovery is personal, but recovery is police-marketed, measured, racialized, gendered, indexed by class and coded in the language of emotional fluency. The world claps for your healing once it fits the story it already wanted to hear. To remain unhealed, then, is not always dysfunction. It's data. It says something about the world that adaptation alone cannot reveal. And some people, by staying unresolved, keep open the very wound that others are paid to deny. This essay, like the lives it speaks for, will not resolve. It refuses to pretend that every pain becomes wisdom, every survival a success. What lingers is not a conclusion but a contour, a silhouette of what cannot be used. There will be no closure here, only consequence. The consequence of truth that outlives its formatting, the consequence of memory that resists its own repackaging, and in that consequence, a final refusal to remain present, unconverted and unadapted. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. This episode was digitally narrated by Holly, who helps bring our ideas to life. And thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. They help us reach more people like you.